Let's get started, everyone.
Maybe just like English.
Thank you all so much for coming here today. I'm Shihoko Goto. I'm the Senior Associate for Northeast Asia here at the Wilson Center. I want to thank the Kissinger Institute for co-sponsoring this event with the Asia program. It's really great to see a full house, and I do apologize for those who are not able to sit down. I hope you will be able to settle down because I believe we will have a very, very good, solid, robust discussion today. As everyone in this room probably is aware, today marks 25 years since the military crackdown on Tiananmen Square. The evolution of China is clear, so that whilst the international community remains concerned about human rights in China, it's really taken a backseat to other issues. Other issues, namely economic outlook for China and prospects for military expansion. But over the last 25 years, there has been a dramatic change in Japan as well, and not just economically, but also politically, socially, and increasingly militarily. The conversation today, I hope, will focus on what kind of relationship Japan wants to have with its neighbors, and especially with China, in light of the changes within its own borders and the changes seen within China and the changes in the Asia-Pacific region at large. Of course, territorial disputes in the East China Sea remain the immediate threat in relations between the two countries, with an unfortunate potential for outright conflict. And it's a big but. Aside from the dispute over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, how does Tokyo see its relationship with Beijing developing in the future? We hear about a need for Washington to develop a grand strategy towards China. There may be one, there may not be one, but that's another topic for another time. What does Tokyo want from China? Does Japan have a grand strategy towards China and indeed towards the Asia-Pacific region at large? The Abe visit, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's visit to Washington in late April, has demonstrated the strength of the US-Japan relationship, and it's also raised expectations from Washington for on Tokyo regarding the military situation. But when it comes to China, Tokyo is clearly not on the same page with Washington. But then what is that stance? What is Japan's stance towards its biggest trading partner, its biggest neighbor? Is there possibility for the two countries to work together on maritime security? Can they reach a détente on the history issue? The list of whats continues to grow. So this is obviously Japan's vision towards China is a big topic, and we don't have a lot of time to discuss it, but I can actually guarantee you that there will be no immediate conclusion after this conversation. But I'm hoping that we can outline some of the concerns, some of the flashpoints, and what kind of issues we should be focused on. And I think to cover all these topics, there is no one really more appropriate than Yoichiro Sato. He actually arrived from Japan yesterday, and he's a professor of international relations at the Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University. He is focused on security issues, but he really looks broader at the diplomatic relations that Japan has with China as well as across Asia. I'd like him to start the discussion today, and we will have Richard McGregor, who is a public policy scholar here at the Washington, I'm sorry, I can't even get my organization's name right. The Wilson Center's, he is a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center, and he's also a former bureau chief of the Financial Times. He's written extensively on China, including the bestseller, The Party.
Sort of bestseller.
And available on Amazon, of course. And he will then be followed by Robert Daly, who is the director of the Kissinger Institute here at the Wilson Center. So with that, Yoichiro.
Sorry, I'll just leave it here. Thank you very much, Shihoko-san, and I'd like to express my gratitude for the Wilson Center as well as the Kissinger Institute for organizing this event and bringing me back to Washington, D.C. U.S.-Japan Alliance business. Let me start talking about the regional economic integration first, and then come back to the alliance aspect. First of all, I think the regional economic integration in Asia, which Japan led during the past 20, 25 years, is continuing to be very important for Japan's economic diplomacy. But some of the driving forces of that, especially in regard to Japan's relation with China, are somewhat shifting direction. And first of all, the Japanese economic integration with China was heavily driven by the Japanese investment in China, which is a big amount in aggregate sum. But one trend which a lot of us overlooked is that the size of each investment has remained relatively small compared to Japanese investments in other regions like North America or in Europe. So that means a lot of smaller companies have been investing in China, but the biggest corporations are still reluctant to invest, to commit large amount of investment in China. And this has become even more pronounced after the demonstration in 2012, which caused riots in China. And I'll come back to that point a little bit later. And the trade relations oftentimes follow investment, and the more Japanese investments take place in China, the more companies wanted to export their products back into Japan or to a third market overseas, or import the components for assembly in China, and the components, of course, come from Japan. So there was active pursuit of free trade between China and Japan during the past years. But again, the political energy to push for the free trade between the two countries, and actually a kind of trilateral setting, including South Korea, is running out of steam. So in that sense, the regional integration policy centered around the triangular relationship between Japan, China, and South Korea is slowing down, to say the least. And at the same time, Japan's willingness to diversify away from China and reduce its proportional economic dependence on China has been quite visible. And the Japanese government decision to nationalize part of the Senkaku Islands in 2012 resulted in large-scale demonstrations and even riots in China. And some Japanese factories were destroyed, damaged, Japanese products were smashed, embassies were attacked. So all of those led to a very strong reluctance of the Japanese corporations, especially the big ones, to commit a big amount of money. And of course, many of you already know that Japan has already stopped providing ODA loans for large infrastructure development in China as of 2008. And since then, the same category of ODA loans has been provided to other countries, and most notably India has become a one of the biggest recipients of this money. To make this trend even more solid, the investment agreement among Japan, South Korea, and China, which was signed in 2013, resulted in a rather unsatisfactory agreement from the Japanese perspective, because China was heavily reluctant to accept a broad definition of national treatment. So the agreement ended up with a narrow definition of national treatment, which translates that Chinese government is more capable of limiting the types of industries in which foreign investment is deregulated. So the China made Japanese entry into the Chinese investment market more difficult. So all of those factors lead to Japan's willingness to diversify into other countries in Asia rather than concentrating its investment in China. The trilateral free trade negotiation likewise has stalled, and this is probably more a problem with Korea rather than with China, but the negotiation is not going anywhere at the moment. So in that sense, the movement toward the what is called RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, with a core of Japan, China, and South Korea as the strongest economies, is not likely to move any faster than the TPP negotiation. So it's clear that Japan's current priority is TPP. And if TPP becomes an incentive to jumpstart the RCEP direction, that's okay. That would be a welcome side product. But the RCEP per se is not the goal at the moment. Let me, thank you, Sony. Okay. And the other observation is that Japan didn't join AIIB, the Chinese initiative to create a new kind of investment and infrastructure development bank in Asia. And instead, Japan has decided to raise capital size for the ADB. Of course, Japan has been quite influential inside ADB. The ADB presidency has been constantly held by Japanese, and ADB is also where American and Japanese can work together for the regional development programs. So Japan is clearly emphasizing ADB over cooperation with China through AIIB. And this also symbolizes the reversal of the trend, because in the aftermath of the Asian economic crisis, Japan was acting very aggressively to promote regional financial cooperation by taking initiatives in such projects as Chanmai Initiative or the Miyazawa Bond. So, but now Japan is moving away from that and trying to re-emphasize cooperation with the United States through Asian Development Bank. So here again, we see the signs that the Japanese economic policy in the region has reversed. And let me go to the security issue and the enhancement of the US-Japan alliance. Many of you probably saw Prime Minister Abe's visit here, and all those celebrations. And after Abe returned to Japan, he's been actively working on the new legislation to actually implement what he has promised during his trip here. But the drivers of this change, of course, first of all, is Chinese naval buildup and assertive maritime claims in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. The interesting feature, however, is that Japan is trying its best not to directly link the perceived Chinese threat with its enhanced security cooperation with the United States, and for good reasons. I'll come back to the reason part a little bit later. The other driver of the closer US-Japan security cooperation is actually the perceived shortcoming of the US commitment to regional security in Asia, particularly during the Bush administration. I said perceived because I don't think Americans thought they were less committed to Asian security, but Japan has observed that America was preoccupied in both Iraq and Afghanistan and not paying enough attention to East Asia. And this didn't improve dramatically when the Obama administration started, because although the Obama administration refocused on Asia through its pivot or rebalance to Asia policy, the actual policy in that was a mix of engagement of China through economic and political diplomatic means and the military deterrence against China. And the balance within the mix wasn't favorable to Japan. Japan wanted to see more deterrence and less engagement, in my reading. So Japan continued to work through diplomatic channels with Washington to emphasize the security aspect, and in a sense, I think that China has shot itself in the foot by adopting more aggressive maritime claims and activities in the region, so that the Japanese argument has become much more credible with very observable evidence. Prime Minister Abe's personal leadership, of course, contributed to this enhancement of the security ties, and so did the more centralized policy-making mechanism within the ruling Liberal Democratic Party. Before, the factions played more like independent parties inside the LDP, but that's no longer the case. The role of the factions has largely diminished. And although the LDP is in coalition with the co-mate or Clean Government Party, the LDP has mastered how to work with coalitions through a long experience of working with this coalition partner. So the decision-making has become much more centralized to the advantage of the Prime Minister. And finally, I think we shouldn't forget that Japan's enhancement of its own security role within the framework of the US-Japan alliance is also driven by Japan's drive for gaining a Security Council seat in the United Nations. The Japan's first attempt during the Koizumi administration didn't succeed, but Prime Minister Abe is relaunching its campaign. So in order to do that, Japan has to actively participate in UN activities and make it easier and make itself a full participant of such activities. So currently, the Japanese troops are still in South Sudan, and they're very committed to continue that deployment. And the caution side of Japan is that, as I said earlier, Japan is pursuing this security enhancement in the name of meeting its global responsibility rather than responding to the increasing assertion of Chinese maritime claims. And not even to talk about the Chinese aggression or Japan's defensive responses to it has a good political reasons, and sorry, I keep touching the wrong part of the screen and the page keeps changing. Okay. Oh yes. Okay. And by doing that, Japan was actually trying to remain consistent with the US rebalance strategy, because rebalance talked about engagement of China and also at the same time deterrence against China. So not to antagonize China unnecessarily was a very important policy objective for Japan as well as the United States. So both countries were on the same note in that regard. But of course, that started changing after the Chinese naval activities have become more active in both South China Sea and East China Sea, and also as the dispute over the Senkaku Islands intensified. But even today, we still see the signs that both US and Japan try to put its military closeness in the name of North Korean threat rather than the Chinese threat. This actually allows both countries to keep diplomatically engaging China in regional security matters, because both US and Japan are actually counting on Chinese diplomatic cooperation in dealing with the North Korean problems. And this gives China a diplomatic space in the regional security affairs. And so the engagement aspect of Japanese policy is not completely dead yet, despite rising tensions between Japan and China. The other caution, I think, is that Japan itself has rather limited naval asset, and trying to counter the potential Chinese naval threats in every front doesn't really make sense for Japan. And since those threats are potential at the moment, so Japan's immediate security cooperation with the United States most recently talks about the possible the Hormuz Strait crisis and demining operation. And Prime Minister Abe even said that demining issue doesn't really, involve the South China Sea contingency. So this really shows that Japan's more focused on immediate threats and most direct kind of threats to its sea lane security. And of course, the other sea lane in the Sea of Aden is actively participated by Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, with Japan's the first and only overseas military base in Djibouti. So those reasons keep Japan rather on the cautious side and keep Japan away from antagonizing China. So let me conclude by briefly speculating possible future scenarios. And I have two scenarios. Both are very similar. One is slowing growth of China and Chinese emphasis on domestic redistribution. That's my first scenario. And the second scenario is similar in the sense that the China's growth will also slow down in the second scenario, but rather as a result, China will fall into a domestic political instability. So in my mind, those two scenarios are likely, although the other possibilities do exist. But I'd like to keep myself to those two scenarios. In the first scenario, China will continue to remain somewhat assertive, like it is now, but the short-term objective is to satisfy domestic nationalism, and China does not immediately try to enforce its claims. So China will continue to expand its naval and maritime capabilities, but rather refrain from actually enforcing what it claims, or maybe keep the claims itself somewhat ambiguous so that it doesn't have to enforce. In that case, US-Japan responses will be limited. But in the second scenario, China will become increasingly more assertive in order to divert domestic frustration and increasingly appeal to nationalism. China will increase its maritime provocations in East China Sea and South China Seas, and in such a scenario, the risk of war will actually escalate, and the US-Japan regional responses in its jointness will be enhanced. And not only that, I think the two countries will move toward a broader coalition to deter China militarily, and such coalition would include Australia, India, and some of the Southeast Asian countries. So that's my second scenario. It's hard to tell at the moment which scenario is more likely than the other, but that's the kind of view I have about the near future. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yuichiro. Before I ask Richard about his comments, I was particularly interested by your analysis of Japan and its leadership in economic integration of the region. I know this is going to come up, so I might as well throw it out. AIIB. By not being part of it, does Japan risk losing more than it has to gain?
Good question. I mean, clearly, Japan's losing some of the opportunities to, profit from regional development, and the loan decisions will be, no doubt tied with the Japanese companies' abilities to win contracts from the regional countries. But at the same time, Japan's enhancing the loan capability of ADB, so there is a way to compensate for the potential loss there. And also, the gain through AIIB is still very prospective, and depends on how China runs these institutions. We might see a kind of a misallocation of fund rather than more efficient allocation of money. And if China starts financing more politically rather than economically, some of the projects will fail and the loans will not be repaid, the business will go bankrupt, and then maybe Japan's not losing as much. So I think we have to wait and see how much Japan is actually losing.
Thank you. Thanks, Shihoko, and thanks very much, Professor Sato. So I'll just make some comments and then I'll try and respond directly to some of the points that Professor Sato has made. Obviously there has been a slight de-escalation between Japan and China on both sides in the sort of diplomatic tension between them. But I think you can get a very good illustration of the general trends in the relationship by the respective leaders, Xi Jinping and Mr. Abe. Both are from political elite families. Both of these political elite families have their roots in the Sino-Japanese War, obviously on different sides. And I think they both draw a lot from that particular history. And of course, if you look at it like that, both men have an interest in discrediting each other's version of history. But I think in many respects, the big trends that they embody haven't really been entrained for some time and are increasingly embedded in the political systems of both countries in terms of bilateral relations. So we have seen, obviously a sharp downturn in ties since 2010 and the like, maybe a little bit before that. But this trend that we see now of hardening on both sides, I really think, starts in the mid-90s. We had a number of things happening in the mid-90s. China's nuclear tests, which the Japanese reacted strongly to, Lee Teng-hui's visit to Cornell, which was followed by the Taiwan Straits crisis, which alongside then Taiwan's presidential election, the U.S.-Japan security treaty revision in about 96, 97, which in some respects was widened to cover Taiwan. All these elements really began to sour bilateral, and of course Jiang Zemin's 1998 trip to Tokyo, where he made a very public deal of demanding an apology, including in front of the emperor. So all of these elements really, I think, hardened what I think is accurately called in Japan a kind of reluctant realism in relations with China. Now, obviously, that didn't continue right through the administration of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao. I think Hu and Wen at different times did try to put relations back on an even keel, even after Mr. Koizumi went, for example. Even after the first stage of anti-Japanese riots in China in 2005, China managed to cool things down a little bit after that. I personally can vividly remember in 2005 when I was heading the Financial Times Bureau in Beijing, and I had a really big internal victory in my company in which they agreed to allow me to buy a new car for the first time in 25 years. And so we replaced the Mitsubishi Land Cruiser with a Honda Odyssey, and we went and bought it in the middle of the anti-Japanese riots. And there was a massive waiting list to get the car. The salespeople went out of their way to tell us it was a Chinese car, not a Japanese car. And so we got it without a problem. But of course, if we go a few years forward to the riots in 2010 and 2012, I think Toyota and Honda and those companies actually really suffered a downturn in sales, which wasn't evident earlier. So I think this has been building, the antagonism between both sides, between both governments, even worse, between both countries' peoples. Now, there's costs and benefits, I think, or benefits depending how you define them. The professor spoke in some respects about the Japanese change in direction in Japanese economic policy in the Asia-Pacific. I think Japanese companies for a long, long time have had a kind of China plus one policy. In other words, most investment in China, but with a little bit elsewhere so they could bring other factories on. That has obviously become much more pronounced now, with directions to invest in India in particular, but also other countries in the Asia Pacific. I think that's a policy that sounds good on paper, but comes with potentially great costs for Japanese companies. The political atmosphere with India might be good, but there's no way that the business climate in India is better than China. You just have to look at the respective size of their economies. China is a much better place to manufacture and make money. The other cost, of course, is the cost to Japanese consumer sales inside China, as I just mentioned, as a result of anti-Japanese sentiment. I think I think the sales have now come back, but it does show you that it is relatively fragile. And I think China is such a large market, you can't simply work your way around it. I would be medium-term reasonably bullish on China. I would expect it to continue to grow for another 5-6 years, 6-7%. Even if I am over-optimistic, I think it's pretty clear that China one day will be a bigger market than the US. I don't think you have to be Pollyanna to assert that. And if you're multinational Japanese companies who want to keep pace with your competitors around the world, then you have to succeed in China. And having a policy which sort of steers you away from that, I think is very negative. The one very bright spot, as anybody who's walked up and down Ginza in Tokyo recently, is Chinese tourism, which has exploded in the last, 1 or 2 years, really, and it's been quite counterintuitive compared to the political relationship. Somebody told me when I was in Beijing recently something the Japanese ambassador had said. The Japanese ambassador didn't say it to me, mind you, so this is second-hand hearsay. But he was lamenting about how he didn't have a voice in China at all. The Japanese voice is really excluded from the media. Japan can't really argue its case in an open fashion. But what he could do was to give as many visas as possible to Chinese tourists going to Japan, and convince them at 200,000 a year or whatever it is, that Japan is not such an evil country after all. So that's a kind of policy, I think, the engage and hedge policy, which in many respects is not that different from US policy. The difference in Japan, of course, is that US is an independent military force, whereas Japan comes under the wing of the US. But I think it's an engage and hedge policy, which in Japan's case, they've had to hedge more and more and more. And I think that's a costly policy to pursue with a neighbour as large and increasingly rich as China. On the point that the professor made about Japan going out of its way not to antagonise China, certainly the rhetoric surrounding the recent revisions in the US-Japan Security Treaty made with Mr. Abe when he was here recently, that's true. The Chinese response, I think, was reasonably muted as well, perhaps mainly because the key changes had been foreshadowed last year, but nonetheless, neither side made a big deal out of it. But, let's face it, everybody knows it's about China, so I don't think anybody's fooling themselves about that. On the issue also of Japan not antagonising China, I think there's little doubt that Japan made some big mistakes in its handling of the 2010 crisis, the Senkaku Diaoyu crisis, when the Japanese locked up the Chinese fishing boat captain on criminal charges and then let him go after the Chinese stamped their feet. That didn't look good. 2012, could that have been handled differently? Did the Japanese central government have an alternative to nationalising those islands? That's very difficult to adjudicate on that because the narratives of the Chinese and Japanese sides about how that happened are so different, but certainly that upset China big time. The history issue, which is too big and too tortured and long-running for me to go into here, of course, is a kind of permanent antagonism, if you like, to China. Of course, it's, you can make the argument that China uses this issue cynically for leverage, but it's not just that. So that's a very difficult issue, and it's an increasingly difficult issue to put back in its box. Final point on the two scenarios that the professor mentioned for China. The first, that it would become, and you tell me if I've described this, summarize it inaccurately. The first, that China would become more inward-looking, but still nationalistic, but more inward-looking. The second, that it would become more assertive and much more nationalistic, and of course that would raise the chances of some kind of military clash. I think that's fair enough. One of the problems, though, is that it's very hard. The signaling between Japan and China, so each really knows what the other is up to, is difficult, I think. And it's very difficult to get the right signals and make sure you get the right message. One of the good things about the de-escalation in diplomatic tensions recently is that I think that the informal ties between Japan and China, the sort of track 2 and track 3 dialogues between the political parties, between Diet members and NPC members and the like, is being restored. So the flow of information and the ability to judge what kind of signals are being sent, I think, is being improved once again. But I think because it is so difficult to work out within both sides' political system, more so in the Chinese sense because China remains so opaque, that's why the situation, I think, remains so dangerous. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Sato. I was listening to your remarks with two different projects in mind. One was my own education, edification, to learn from you, so thank you for that. But I was also listening, wondering what the response from Chinese and think tanks or universities, the people I know in government, might be. And I would like to go back to what I think was the dialogue that was the genesis of this program, that Shihoko and I spoke about the state of Sino-Japanese relations, which are very concerning to us and to the United States. And we were struck that we know very well each country's list of grievances with the other. These have been rehearsed again and again. But there is very little sense coming out of either Beijing or Tokyo of what either country's positive, constructive, long-term vision for the relationship might be. And we don't hear conversations occurring on those grounds. And the point of talking about this, about the vision, is not to attempt to wish away these very real problems, but to try to manage them more effectively based on knowledge or a vision of where we would like to get. And so that was the question of what that vision might be of China for its relations with Japan, and Japan for its relations with China. So sort of in an imaginary proxy, listening from the point of view of my Chinese friends, I did not hear in your remarks an articulation of a long-term vision or constructive vision or sustainable vision for Sino-Japanese relations. I was also struck, especially from a Chinese point of view, by some of the silences, the things that you didn't mention, and this will echo a little bit what Richard said. No mention of what may have been Japanese contributions to policies or decisions that led to the current state in the relationship, including in the Senkaku Diaoyu disputes, and of course in the Prime Minister Abe and some of his other cabinet members' statements on history, which are extremely sensitive. And again, I'd like to echo Richard that these are sometimes manipulated cynically for China's purposes, but it is not just that. Having lived in Nanjing from 2001 to 2007, I know it isn't that, and I think it's essential to have an understanding of how China views these questions, because it plays out in very concrete ways. I'm often struck in my discussions about Japan with Chinese friends that for them, there is an absolutely clear and essential link between Japan's policy toward the Diaoyu Senkakus and Abe's views toward history. This is all part of a narrative about Japanese perfidy, whereas Americans see both issues but tend not to link them. We tend to think that they are separate, but they have to be part of any discussion, certainly, of China's response to Japan. I also didn't get a sense in your remarks of what China and China's rise might mean for Japan more broadly. You seemed instead to emphasize Japan's increasing emphasis on global and regional issues in a manner that seems to perhaps imply a desire to turn away from China and the current disputes, to turn away from historical questions, and in a sense, almost to turn away from geography, as though there can be a simple turning of the head away from this large country across a not very large ocean. And so I'd like to ask you to respond to that. That may not be a fair read, but then sort of listening just for myself, again, I didn't hear you attempt to describe a vision for long-term constructive relations, so I'd like to invite you to take another shot at that if you care to. But again, there does seem to be an assumption perhaps that Japan has an option of almost withdrawing from or resigning from an intensive Japanese-Chinese relationship, a sense that China is a declining interest and Japan can simply look elsewhere. Now, on the other side of the equation, we were also asking at the outset whether China has a vision for Japan, a long-term constructive vision, and I'm not sure that it does, and I hope that some of our Chinese guests will ask about that. The most concerning part of the Chinese vision clearly deals with security for Japan, in that China objects strongly both to Japan's alliance with the United States and to Japan's interest in perhaps revising its constitution and playing a bigger part in its own defense. So what rights does China think that Japan might have to have its own security? So that is really my concern. It's not so much, there's not a sense of what China and Japan want from each other positively, maybe a tendency to wish away. The United States hasn't figured out which lenses to use to look at China yet, but it's looking intensely, trying different lenses. We haven't found them yet. Whereas I sense in your remarks, as well as in remarks I've heard elsewhere, almost a desire to look away rather than to find the proper lenses. And so I just wanted to put that out for the general discussion, but also ask if you do see a long-term constructive relationship, a vision for which might guide management of current problems.
A longer-term vision of cooperation.
Well, it doesn't have to be, I don't want to push them into the cooperation, but something that's constructive.
Or-
What should China and Japan be aiming for beyond the disputes that we've
Or
discussed?
are there?
Or are there?
Are
Is
there?
is there, or perhaps there is none?
Thank you very much for both comments. And actually, I'm quite amazed that you mentioned some of the gaps between the Japanese perspective and the American perspective. And here I see that Japanese are trying to figure out what America's long-term strategy toward China is. And Americans are asking the Japanese, what is Japan's long-term strategy toward China? And we're kind of looking at each other and trying
You
to
go first.
figure out. But of course, from Japanese perspective, Japan cannot be proactive in that. Because U.S. is a bigger power and bigger alliance partner, and until the U.S. determines its mind, Japan cannot even start thinking about what Japan should be doing. And even when Japan starts thinking about what it should be doing, it's not a guarantee that what Japan will be doing is satisfactory to the United States. So that's the kind of challenge we are facing at the moment. And you said, does Japan have any strategy other than wishing China away?
I think I used the word vision. I don't think I used the word strategy, which
Okay,
is a somewhat
vision.
different question.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure if Japan has such a concrete long-term vision. And I think currently Japan's vision is defined in a negative term, in the sense that Japan clearly knows what it doesn't want, but Japan doesn't really know what it wants. You also asked about China's, long-term vision. I think China has a long-term vision, and Japan is very well accepted inside, in the sense of inside second archipelagic line and all that. I think China is trying to restore its old glory and aiming at the full revision of the existing international order in the region. And that's something completely against what Japan would like to see. So in that sense, Japan knows exactly what it doesn't want, defined in a negative way. But what should Japan be doing to avoid that? Really depends on what America wants to see and what America is capable of achieving with some Japanese help. And then Japan can think about whether Japan can provide that help. So in that sense, Japan is reactive.
Thank you.
So just on one point, I think as the professor says, it's the saying that China wants nothing less than the full revision of the sort of geopolitical order in Asia Pacific. That may well be right. I think that's a big debate in Washington at the moment, whether China in sort of expanding into the South China Sea, pushing up against Japan is kind of making it up as they go, feeling the stones as they cross the river, seeing how far they can get, or whether this is a part of, small steps as part of a systematic plan and the like. But I think part of that equation, if you're trying to assess China's policy, is what is China's assessment of Japan in terms of Japanese power? I think you said earlier that the Japanese naval capabilities were limited. I guess that may be the case, but many people have a very high assessment of their actual capabilities of both the naval forces and the submarines. I'm not sure what China thinks about that. But certainly there is a sort of school of thought in China a school of thought that holds that the Chinese think that Japan is a declining power and in inexorable decline, and thus China does not have to take so much account of what Japan thinks. Now, obviously, Mr. Abe is trying to arrest that and revitalize the country, not only economically, but I guess he would say in spirit as well. And part of that involves not just getting closer to the US, but I would have thought having a much more active role in the US-Japan alliance. One of the weird, if that's the right word, is the US has been both ally and overlord with Japan. And this is a treaty which has lasted an incredible 70 years. Somebody writing in Foreign Affairs magazine said recently it was the longest surviving treaty between two great powers since the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia. It's quite a good line. And I haven't been able to disprove that. But I wonder, I'm very interested to know what, in Japan, what they think China's assessment of Japan is. I mean, does China underestimate Japan? Particularly as you say, Japan is the first line that they have to cross to get out into the wider Pacific, an area which they want to, in fact, dominate.
Thank you very much. With China underestimating Japan, I think to some extent that's true, but I think at the same time China has been exaggerating Japan's increasing security profile in order to keep it down. And No, when Japan nominated itself as a candidate for a permanent member in the UN Security Council, China was the real and pretty much only opponent to that. The US didn't support, but for different reasons. US didn't want to see too many others coming along with Japan into the Security Council. But China was most opposed. And to carry out that opposition, it was very convenient for China to, ring the alarm bell against the revival of Japanese militarism and all that, and the history issue became a very convenient tool of that. But what China is really afraid, when this talk about the U.S.-Japan alliance as a cork in the bottle, analogy. There is some truth to that view of the alliance by China. The U.S. has told the Chinese that the alliance actually keeps Japan from, re-rising as a military power. Therefore, it's good for China, and China bought it. China bought that line of explanations, and although the China is increasingly more skeptical about that explanation about the U.S.-Japan alliance, there is still some remaining belief that without the alliance, Japan will re-rise as a formidable military power, and that would be worse than having the US-Japan alliance in the region. I think that view still remains to some extent in China.
We are recording this, so if you could wait for a microphone to come to you, and if you could identify yourself and keep your question fairly brief, because I believe there are a lot of questions. So who would like to go first? The gentleman here.
Thank you very much. My name is Shibusawa from GID, right here in Washington, D.C. I'd like to ask two questions to the professor. One is, as part of the regional cooperation, you mentioned AIIB. And you said Japan has decided to stay away for the time being from this multilateral financial institution. Do you think this was the right decision on the part of Japan? Because when you look at the needs for infrastructure, that's economic infrastructure I'm talking about, such as roads, airports, railway, and the ocean transport, nobody denies there is a huge deficit. Now, the ADB is talked about, what Japan depends on ADB. Well, ADB's capital is slightly over that of capital to be being put together, which is $100 billion. And ADB is more than $100 billion. But ADB has to take care of everything. Aside from economic infrastructure, they have to take care of social infrastructure such as education and health, and not to mention rural development and things like that. Of course, the World Bank has the largest capital, but not that much more, especially when you take into account of the needs to take care of development globally, including Africa. So I wonder if Japanese decision to stay away, not to mention the US decision to stay away, it was, in your view, a good thing, because by staying away, you were not able to be part of coming up with bylaws including procurement and procedure and so forth. Second question I have is you mentioned TPP, and so that's Japanese priority. Well, I presume by that you meant the priority established by the Abe administration and by a group of big corporations, a member of the Keidanren. I don't know if the priority includes the agriculture sector and small and medium sized company. Besides, do you think it's going to be possible to come to a conclusion when the US, for instance, is very much against in automobile sector of not reducing the 25% tariff on light trucks, which include sport utility vehicles? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. On the first question about the Japan's non-participation at the moment in AIIB, is it a wise decision or not? It depends on what Japan's interest emphasis is, and I think Japan has clearly prioritized the broader security policy over more specific economic policy. So in that sense, it was definitely the government decision, Abe government decision to do that. And I think there is a lot of more considerations. The financial sector has its own interest, and I think Treasury Ministry has its own interests. But overall, I think the determination was based on the expectation that there is no way Japan can play a dominant role in this new institution. And by participating, probably Japan will be helping China more than helping itself. So that's why probably Japan refrained from participation at the moment. And the TPP, I'm pretty sure you're right about Japan's agriculture sector. The farm sector is really against TPP, and I can see that in my neighborhood everywhere. I live in Oita Prefecture, so. But here again, I think the consideration is more than just economic interests, and sure, the automobile sector is really difficult. It has always been difficult in US-Japan relations, and it's not going to change. But I think in terms of trade rules, Japan has committed to a more liberal and kind of principle-oriented economic regime rather than the kind of exception-loaded and somewhat more protective and socialist mode of networking proposed by China.
Why don't we take?
My name is Anh Nguyen, and I'm an intern at the Wilson Center. So I have a question for the professor. How does the conflict in South China Sea affect Japan, and what is its stance on Vietnam and the South China Sea? Because I have heard that the more Chinese aggression in South China Sea will take the heat away from the Senkaku and Diaoyu disputes in the East China Sea. So what is Japan's stance on that?
Oh, I see. Well, I don't think the dispute in the South China Sea will take the heat away from Japan. The reverse was true to some extent. The tension in the East China Sea gave some break to the Southeast Asians, but not the other way around. I mean, China has always been very assertive on the Senkaku issue since about the 2010 fishing boat incident. And Japan hasn't been given any break despite the rising tensions in the South China Sea. But what is Japan's interest in South China Sea? Japan is very much committed to the freedom of the sea and China's reclaiming of some of those features, islands, rocks, reefs, is very disconcerting for Japan and the United States. And sure, I mean, South China Sea sea lanes can be bypassed in the emergency, but the economic cost from doing that is quite substantial. So Japan wants to maintain the current status quo. And in terms of the military activities by the United States, Japan is very much in line with the U.S. activities, and because of its alliance relation with the United States, Japan is backing the U.S. interpretation. Also, that means that against the Chinese military espionage activities inside Japanese EEZs, Japan cannot loudly complain against China.
I'm Stanley Kober. We've been assuming a continuing rising growth of China, but it seems to me China has two serious problems. One, the demography. The working age population has now peaked and is declining. That's got to affect the economic growth. Second, a lot of the growth was financed by debt, and a lot of the debt is no good. The non-performing loans are increasing. I'm looking at an article that appeared on Chinese Central Television about a month ago, and it quotes Ma Jun, the chief economist with the Research Bureau of the People's Bank of China, who says, China's economy now faces grave downward pressure. This is the chief economist of the People's Bank of China. What if our assumptions of China are incorrect with regard to this continuing growth?
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, in the two scenarios I saw likely, China is slowing down in both scenarios. So I'm not assuming that China will continue to grow at the current pace. So I think it's inevitable that China slows down, and we are already seeing the signs of that today. And so, but nonetheless, China will not immediately become, aged economy like Japan, growing at less than 1% for, one whole decade, or, China is not going to be like that. I think China will continue to grow, but at a slowing pace. And so I think that is more likely assumption than either continuation of the fast growth or some sort of sudden collapse. I think neither is likely. Truth is probably somewhere in the middle.
Excuse me, Marvin Ott, Wilson Center. I'd like to just pursue a little bit further looking south from Japan. As someone interested in Southeast Asia, I'm struck by, on the one hand, your statement that the Abe administration is prioritizing security relations, and also your earlier comments about diversifying economic activity away from China elsewhere into Asia. And I guess I'd ask you to sort of speculate, given those two themes, how much potential is there for a really serious focus from Tokyo on Southeast Asia? Security ties, economic ties, really generating a qualitatively new and different quality of relationship with the region. Vice the current sort of small steps, very cautious, very limited.
Thank you very much. That's a very great question, but the answer will be very difficult because Southeast Asia is such a diverse region, and Japan has to really make kind of tailor-made policy toward each of the Southeast Asian countries. And I think security-wise, the closest ties are developing with countries like the Philippines, Singapore, and Vietnam. With Singapore, it has an earlier history focusing on maritime piracy, and anti-piracy cooperation is the area Japan has been very active. But this has a great potential to evolve into a broader maritime security cooperation. But for now, Singapore is more closely working with the United States, and therefore doesn't really necessarily seeking immediate tie-up with Japan. So that growth is potential, but only at the pace of not to unnecessarily provoke China. But with the Philippines and Vietnam, it's a different case. Japan is already providing patrol boats to the Philippines, and the first group of boats will be provided this year to Vietnam. So active security cooperation is already taking place with those partners. Others like Myanmar, the political relations really strengthening, and Japan is very much in line with the U.S. support for Myanmar's democratic turnaround. And you see a kind of reverse situation in Thailand, going back from democracy to military coup government. But here again, Japan's still trying not to keep Thailand away, because the experience of turning Myanmar away only advantaged China, and neither US or Japan wants to repeat that. So both countries are quite cautious about how to deal with Thailand's coup government. So I think Japan has really different ways of approaching each Southeast Asian countries.
Thank you, for Professor Sato. My question is about Japan's soft power. A total of 1.8 million Chinese tourists visit Japan during the Sakura season, and also Japanese film Doraemon Stand By Me topped China's box office and earned 33 million in the first opening weekend. At the same time, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang purchased a Doraemon Ningyo while visiting a manufacturing factory in South China. These had caught the Chinese President Xi Jinping's attention, and he sent a private letter to Prime Minister Shinzo Abe expressing his desire to meet Abe again. So based on the current messages sent by China's top political leaders and the Chinese people's passion about Japan, what role does the Japanese soft power play in the Sino-Japanese relations? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good comment, and I can share some funny story. My Chinese student was back home during the demonstration, and she said she witnessed a demonstrator wearing a Hello Kitty shirts. So, I mean, that's something. And I think that the younger generations who grew up with this kind of, really flood of Japanese pop culture throughout Asia, and those who have access to the news coming out of Japan through internet and other media, the proportion of those more kind of open-minded and the people with diverse perspectives in China is growing. and that's one hope I have in the bilateral relations. The more young Chinese, especially, grow up with open mind and become more skeptical about the government propaganda inside China, there is a good hope that the bilateral relationship between Japan and China can be managed.
I actually want to follow up on what Richard said in his opening remarks. He said that relations between China and Japan have really hardened since the early mid-90s. And he also pointed out that Xi Jinping and Shinzo Abe are both, for familial reasons, are more militaristic in their approach. If you would agree with that assessment, would you say that under the current leaderships, under these two men, that Sino-Japanese relations are not going to improve, that there has to be a change in leadership, and it's not going to come from China, so it has to be a change first from Japan? Is that something that you would agree with or disagree with? Personalities matter, or do they not?
I think it does. The personality of the leaders does matter. And I think Prime Minister Abe has been quite stubborn when it comes to certain issues. But at the same time, I'm not sure how much the personality can actually make a change. And, former Prime Minister Fukuda has been acting as a sort of emissary to China on certain key issues. But, and this is based on the expectation that Fukuda's, the personal relationship China does matter in terms of kind of mending the relationship between the two countries. But I'm not sure how effective that was. So we'll see. I mean, what if Japan changed its prime minister, and then would Japan and Korea work better? I'm not sure.
Questions?
Thank you. My name is Kakumi Kobayashi with the Kyodo News of Japan. I would like to just follow up question about the South China Sea. I would like any of you in the panel the opinion to hear the opinion about the future relations in Japan and China in connection with what's happening in between China and U.S. in the South China Sea. They have the tension. The increase has been increasing between China and the United States over the what the U.S. call the surveillance of some areas in the South China Sea. Would that tension, would that make China just harden stance toward Japan regarding it as a close ally to the U.S., or could that encourage China to seek closer ties with Japan in a bit to kind of driving a wedge between Japan and U.S., or any other possibilities? Thank you.
Well, I think definitely the former. I think the Japanese support for the US-led position in the South China Sea is just another, for the Chinese, example of Japanese sort of ganging up with the Americans. The China has had a different view over different times about the US-Japan security treaty. In the 70s, they decided it was a good thing. Regional security and the like, there's a long history of this. Then, of course, the Kissinger and later others convinced China that it was the cork in the bottle of Japanese militarism. I think those days are long gone now. I don't think, the Chinese talk a lot about Japanese militarism, but anybody who's been to Japan knows that's kind of nonsense. You might say America is militaristic, because you see the military all over America, but not Japan. But I think, Japan, it means that the Chinese can't talk about Japanese security in a coherent fashion because, of course, Japan is rearming to some extent and trying to become a more assertive regional player. So I think, the South China Sea will add to Chinese suspicions. And I also think, and we haven't really pinned this down today, is what does Japan want to do that the US doesn't want to do? I wonder if, as the professor said, that Japan will be reactive. I wonder whether they'll start to be, once the laws are passed through the Diet this year, whether Japan will start to be a little bit less reactive and start to have a much stronger view about what the US should do and whether the US should be more assertive. And I think that's when relations between perhaps the US and Japan could be a lot trickier if we got to that point.
And I agree with that, but I think we also need to keep track of not separating the South China Sea issues and the East China Sea issues absolutely, because the big question is about what the security architecture will be, how must it change, who is going to make sort of the rules and the determinations for all of the Western Pacific. And so you don't need, sometimes it's helpful to atomize these questions, sometimes it isn't. I think that in terms of those bigger overall long-term questions, that I don't see much evidence that China is looking at Japan as a pawn at all in the latter way that you suggested. I think it's more the former, but it's a secondary concern in terms of the question of who determines the new architecture for the region.
Excuse me, Ken Meyercord, WorldDocs. You've suggested that Japan is very much the junior partner in its relations with the United States. With regard to Japan's attitude towards China or policy towards China, what option does it have to diverge from the American policy towards China? We've talked a bit about that. To take a concrete example, plausible. If Japan, in the interest of better relations with China, decided to relinquish its claim to the Senkakus, and the United States was opposed to that, could Japan do that? Or vice versa, if the United States decided it made a mistake turning control of the Senkakus over to Japan in 1972, and therefore would not support the Japanese position, could the Japanese maintain their claim to those islands?
Thank you. The U.S. commitment to the defense of the Senkaku has been, in my view, upgraded during the last few years. And in terms of the question of sovereignty, the U.S. is still neutral, but the U.S. supports the existing administrative control by Japan and opposes the change of the status quo by any means other than negotiation. So in that sense, I think U.S. commitment has been slightly upgraded in the last few years. And so I'm not worried about the U.S. giving up on Japan on the Senkaku Island issues. And will Japan relinquish its claim over the Senkaku, claim and administrative control over the Senkaku for the sake of improving relationship with China? I don't think that's realistic at all. And I think the dominant Japanese view is that you give an inch to China, China will demand more. And the next thing you know, China will be claiming Okinawa.
We have time for one more question. I want to make sure that there are no hands in the back that I missed.
Thank you, reporter from the Voice of America. I have a follow-up question about the younger generation. You mentioned that the more the younger Chinese generation embrace the Japanese culture, you hope it would be easier for them to solve the problem between Japan and China. So what if I want to know the Japanese younger generation, whether they also have this similar embrace into Chinese culture, or because I'm been into various seminars and I was kept reminding that 80 or 90% of Japanese actually do not like China now. So just wondering.
And vice versa.
Thank you very much. At my university, half of the students are international students, and this is one of Japan's kind of new experiment of creating global campuses. And the government just started providing subsidies to create, similar programs in 36 other universities. So they're getting subsidies, and using the subsidies, they're recruiting English-speaking lecturers and using those money to offer courses in English so that international students can actually take classes in Japanese universities. We are forerunner of that endeavor. The largest international student group at my university is Chinese. So we have more than 100 Chinese students in each cohort. So overall, I think there are close to 500, 600 Chinese students at any given time. During the height of the Senkaku Island dispute, I was afraid that some of the students might try to kind of form protest activities and things like that. And I even suspected that maybe the government has sneaked in some agitators, and none of that happened. So I was quite amazed and
relieved.
And relieved, yes, indeed. Because what are they gonna burn? my office. So Doraemon, yeah. Hang Hello Kitty. But I think that's what international education can do. Broaden the perspectives and enhance mutual understanding. And it's working both ways. In general, Japanese don't get aggressive over the Sino-Japanese disputes. During the fishing boat crisis and during the demonstration in China, I was having dinner with my friend in Chinatown in Yokohama, and nobody was smashing glasses in any of those restaurants or buildings, and nothing. So, and on the campus, nothing happened. So in that sense, I think that despite dislike of China among the Japanese population in recent years, the Japanese are still well aware that the economic integration is already pretty strong, and the physical conflict between the two nations will only a lose-lose kind of situation. So there's a great support for avoiding that.
Well, on that upbeat note, I hope you will join me in thanking our speakers, but most particularly Professor Sato, who's come from Japan, not Tokyo, from Beppu, which is in southern Japan. So he's
hot spring capital of Japan.
So thank you all very much. And one other thing, Professor Sato will be writing a policy analysis brief on this, so stay tuned. Thank you for coming.